You ever find yourself saying, I'm only gonna have a couple of chips, and then next thing you know, you ate the entire bag? Many times we talk about being addicted to food. Oh my gosh, I'm addicted to chips, to ice cream, to burgers. But is food addiction a real thing? Today in Therapy Corner, I'm bringing an expert in food addiction, Dr. Ashley Gerhart from the University of Michigan, and she's going to tell us everything we need to know about food addiction. Hi everybody, welcome to Therapy Corner. Today we have Dr. Ashley Gerhart. She is an expert in food addiction, and she's a good friend of mine from grad school when we were at Yale. Ashley is the director of the Food and Addiction Science and Treatment Lab at the University of Michigan, where she's also a professor in the psychology department. She's a very well-known researcher in the field of addiction with over 100 articles. She's also gotten funding from some of the best organizations in the country, like the National Institute for Health and the American Heart Association. And perhaps more importantly, Ashley developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which has been cited over 100 times and translated to more than 10 languages. And it's basically the standard instrument for evaluating whether people struggle with food addiction. So let's welcome Ashley to Therapy Corner today.
Hi, it's my pleasure to be here to chat with you.
Very excited to have you, Ashley. So how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I've had some coffee this morning, and that really helps.
All right, so let's get going. How did you end up studying food addiction? That is such an interesting concept. Like, what got you to that point?
Absolutely. So I came in to study alcohol, and alcohol was really fascinating, but at the same time, there was starting to be more and more of a focus on the obesity epidemic. How the mechanisms that we see in classic addictions might also be contributing to the rising rates of obesity in our society and around the globe.
Got it. That's very cool. So then what were some of the first indications, when you were in grad school, that you were onto something?
One was some really beautiful animal models looking at how rats responded to diets that were high in sugar. Nicole Lavina and Bart Hobel from Princeton were pioneering this work. And what they were finding were really kind of shocking similarities between rats that were consuming a lot of sugar, showing both behavioral and biological changes that we essentially think of as key indicators of addiction. So changes in the reward system of the brain, binging behavior, actually going through withdrawal, exhibiting tolerance to the sugar, needing to consume more and more. And at the same time, neuroimaging research was really finding these parallels between individuals with obesity and individuals with substance use disorders, and the way that the reward systems of the brain responded to kind of cues and even the consumption of drugs and food. So there were all these kind of parallel avenues. But we were kind of at that point using obesity as this proxy for being addicted to certain types of food. But we felt like there were some really big issues with, is that really addiction? I mean, obesity is really multifaceted. There's a number of different pathways that can lead someone to have a elevated body mass index, genetics, medication side effects, minimal exercise. And also, there's ways that you could mask an unhealthy relationship with food in a way that it might not show up in your BMI through things like excessive exercising, or you're quite young and so your metabolism hasn't slowed down yet. And that generally, when we're looking in our clinics to diagnose whether someone has a substance use disorder, there's a certain set of behavioral criteria that we check to see whether this is not just somebody who's a heavy user or social user, but that they're actually seeming to have a substance use disorder. And so what I did is initially in grad school is we translated those diagnostic criteria for substances to apply specifically to the consumption of these really highly palatable, highly refined foods that were the foods that people were most likely to binge and crave and eat to a point where they felt like they couldn't control them.
Like ice cream or chocolate?
Absolutely. So the foods that we see that people report being most likely to struggle with in an addictive way are foods that are high in refined carbohydrates like sugars or flours or starches, and also high in fat, and often high in salt as well. So you hit some really important ones there. So ice cream, chocolate, pizza, french fries, potato chips, none of these are surprising, right? But it was really important to see that it's not just the act of eating. It's not just any food that seems to trigger this process, but that it's really something about these foods that are so distinct. They've been processed, they're developed by the industry in many cases to be highly, highly rewarding. And they're so different than naturally occurring foods that our brains really evolved to handle. If you think of naturally occurring foods, there are foods that are higher in sugar, something like a fruit, and there are foods that are higher in fat, like nuts, but it's at much lower doses than the processed junk food in our society, and it's also you're either high in sugar or fat. The fact that so many of our processed foods are a combined package of refined carbohydrates and fat is evolutionarily novel. It's something our brains never quite were engineered to know what to do with and handle. The question is, have they become so powerfully rewarding and reinforcing that they're capable, at least for some people, of stamping in that kind of addictive, compulsive drive that keeps people hooked even when they have type 2 diabetes, or the way that they're consuming these foods really is impacting their mental and physical health, but they're kind of still hooked.
Got it. So they end up hooking people in the same way as a street drug, like you would say heroin, or you would say cocaine, or perhaps alcohol.
Yeah, so I think, I think when people hear that, they often think, oh my gosh, like, you're comparing Oreos and heroin, are you kidding me? And you're right, like that looks really different when you have a drug that's really intoxicating and it's illegal and you can overdose on it. And so initially it looks like food and the highly processed foods and these really intoxicating drugs don't have anything in common.
Right.
But then when you look at something like cigarettes, for a long time, for decades, the addiction and the lay public really were not willing to kind of acknowledge that cigarettes could be addictive because they're legal and they were highly accessible, they were relatively cheap, you're not getting intoxicated.
Right.
And yet, of all the traditional addictive substances, cigarettes are the biggest killer. They're the number one leading cause of preventable death for addictive drugs, even with the opioid epidemic. And so our understanding of what addiction can look like really changed when we started to understand that things like cigarettes could be addictive. So food kind of looks a lot more like a cigarette, where it's not intoxicating, but it keeps people kind of hooked in this way where they're kind of compulsively coming back to it, even though it's really damaging their mental or physical health. And we live in an environment where it's constantly being triggered. In some ways, we all have to eat. And I think that's a really important distinction. These foods are on every corner and billboards. You walk out, you're going to get some office supplies because you ran out of pens. You go to checkout and there's a whole candy display. You go to a 9 a.m. meeting when you're tired and you're groggy and your coffee hasn't kicked in yet. There's a very good likelihood that there's going to be some donuts or some bagels or foods that might be triggering for you.
Totally.
So you are almost constantly having to guard yourself against these triggers in a way that if you are struggling with heroin, it's much easier to avoid specific situations that might be triggering. And so when I first started to do this work, I thought, can this really be as bad, as something like alcohol addiction or cocaine addiction? And yet, as I've talked with people who really identify as being addicted to these foods, I've actually grown to actually think in some ways it's worse because it's so
because it's
constant.
Sneaky, right?
It's sneaky and it's constant, and it's something that for many people started at a very, very early age. You start getting exposed to these foods when you're as young as 1 year old, and even if they're mildly addictive, even if they're not nearly as addictive as something like cocaine or heroin. But you're getting exposed to them so early in life when your brain is more vulnerable, you're emotionally more vulnerable, and that it can start to be this lifelong struggle that you're constantly being bombarded with cues and triggers that you have to navigate all the time.
Right, no, absolutely. And I think what is really fascinating is, your work sort of illustrates how complex addictions are, right?
Absolutely.
And I give you a quick example of heroin or cocaine or alcohol, and even those drugs in themselves are very different. From the physiological, the psychological, and the contextual cues that relate to them. And
totally
food is
right.
completely different. And I feel like this is helping also evolve the conversation as to what addiction is.
I agree with you.
It's not the same, and it's not the same for every person as well.
That's absolutely true as well, where addiction is very individual. Like the way it presents can look very, very distinct and very different.
This brings us to the end of the first part of the interview on food addiction. If you want to learn more about tips for managing food addiction or about some of the treatments that might work, please check out part 2. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoy the content, please help us grow. You can do so in a number of ways. You can share links to the video, or you can share my posts on social media. I'm Dr. Amelia Aldeo, both on Twitter and on Instagram. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.